This is Quintus Jett, president of Abundance for America, and also co-creator with Rachel Yuan of the Yang Treasure Maps. And so today I'm going to focus on New Hampshire. I'm going to be winging this one just a little bit for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that the Iowa primary starts in several days, and then within a week of that is going to be the New Hampshire primaries on the 4th of February. And time is short, and New Hampshire is coming up, and also within the next 50 days, pretty much most of you who are watching this will have had the opportunity to vote in the Democratic primary. So there's going to be a lot of states to go through. Treasure maps, we have treasure maps of Abundance for America, we have treasure maps of every single state, and also Puerto Rico. And so there's a lot to get through, and there's a lot to sort of figuring out what's the best way to communicate this with all of you. Even though, I mean, you can come to our website and get the treasure maps firsthand, but I'm looking for ways of complementing that with we're complementing this with some kind of commentary about it. So one of the things about New Hampshire is that, I mean, allows me to wing it is I'm not from there, but I've spent some time there. Like, I know what it's like to be in New Hampshire. A long time ago, before I lived there, there's a brother I knew. We knew in grad school. He was from Vermont, and we used to make fun of him. It's like, man, yeah, like Vermont's right next to New Hampshire. But we're like, man, Vermont, black people in Vermont, you know. But as karma would have it, eventually, like years later, I would be taking this in a transportation minivan from Boston 2.5 hours up to Dartmouth College for a faculty interview in the middle of winter, and eventually I would be I'd have a faculty position at Dartmouth. And so, yeah, as it would have it, I lived up in Dartmouth, in the Dartmouth area in New Hampshire, right across the border, just immediately across the border from Vermont. And so I know what it's like to be there. I know how, like, you can walk out in the middle of the day, like any time of the season, any season, and actually every season is beautiful there. In New Hampshire, really, from the summer, spring, winter, there's a fall, there's a beauty to all of it. Or being out in rural New Hampshire and being able to, which is kind of remarkable. Just there's so many stars you can see. It's the sweet sound of the plow in your town. In the town I was in the middle of the night when there's heavy snow, and I could hear the plows going. So I knew that at least, you know, the roads would be decent and salted and that kind of stuff. Even down to being African American up there, whether it's you know, the hour and some change drive that I need to take to Manchester to get my hair cut, actually from a white woman named Shelley, who was very good, to the fact that when I lived in New Hampshire and would travel to it, I think I've been pulled over by the police more so in New Hampshire than I've ever been anyplace else. Daytime, nighttime, some reasons that could be seen as legitimate. Sometimes this seemed a little sketchy, but actually, I never gotten a ticket. So all the complications and nuances of New Hampshire, I've experienced, and I've seen different parts of it too. Like, you know, when I was living there, and most of all, I learned to like it. so even though even when I had a job outside of New Hampshire and I was no longer like there, I would still come back. So with that perspective, I'm going to talk about New Hampshire. So from a voting standpoint, one of the things that makes New Hampshire unique, or not unique, well, maybe, possibly, and it's not just that it's first, but there are more undeclared voters in New Hampshire, like that category of undeclared. There's more undeclared voters than either Democrats or Republicans. That's the biggest group, is the undeclared, and it's a very well voter friendly centric state. So when I lived in New Hampshire, I was an undeclared voter. And what you're an undeclared voter, what that means for the primaries is you can stand in line and go to your precinct, and you can, as an undeclared voter, you can participate in one or the other primary, the Democrat or the Republican primary. And so I would, you could sit in line, and then when you come up to the election folks, they'd say, which primary do you want to be in, Democrat or Republican? And then you would say, and they would give you a ballot for that party. You would vote, and on your way out of the voting, they'd say, do you want to stay in this party or do you want to be undeclared? Go back to that. Very friendly for us, like, the voters. And so that is why New Hampshire is so unreliable to poll sometimes, right? Because the biggest group is undeclared, and they can decide which primary, if they want to participate in. So that's the nature of the race, the primary race in New Hampshire. So I have up already the treasure map for it, and so to give you an idea, like we have to the south is Massachusetts. To the west over here is Vermont, and just up here, like a little bit from like the Stratford around this area, is like you're going into Maine. And so one way to think about this is Yang supporters, Yang Gang, is that if you're in Vermont, if you're a Yang Gang in Vermont, you have a great opportunity to help the movement by coming across the Connecticut River into New Hampshire to really help out. If you're one of those people who lives in Vermont, just off the other side of the Connecticut River, what I'm saying, I know, is not news to you. I'm just sort of saying it just so that other people who are not from the area can be aware of just how close you are. That basically there are towns on this side of on the western side of the New Hampshire where literally you can cross back and forth from New Hampshire and Vermont, and people do it every day. I used to myself, in order to drive to work, I would literally most times I would cross over the river into through White River Junction, drive up Highway 91, and then dip back into across the river bridge into New Hampshire to go to Dartmouth. So I understand that's how it works. And then places like if you're in the Portsmouth area, like sort of like down this way, I mean, you're very close to Maine. So basically Yang Gang in Maine, who are in the southern part of Maine, they can kind of help out. And in Massachusetts, most of the population of New Hampshire is in southern New Hampshire. These counties of Hillsborough, Merrimack, and Rockingham. And so literally there are people who may have jobs in Massachusetts, but they live in New Hampshire. They live in Londonderry or something, and they sort of just kind of come back and forth. So Yang Gang, what this means is this is a New England affair, very much so. That sort of Yang Gang from Massachusetts coming up north, Yang Gang in Maine coming from the south, coming from north to the south, Vermont Yang Gang, who are right at the border, coming over to the coming over east into New Hampshire. And then what's kind of convenient, because of the way the DNC and its incentives and things like that, these three states I just mentioned, Vermont, additional states, Vermont, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire and Maine are all Super Tuesday states. So in other words, Yang Gang from these other adjacent states, you can kind of come in, help New Hampshire in the near term. And then after that is over, within about 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks, there will be people, those of you in New Hampshire can then go back outward into these adjacent states that you're nearby to help them out as they're part of Super Tuesday on March the 3rd. a couple things about the treasure maps. I mean, basically, point out that, I mean, so we see that we have Y counties and we have an A county. So what this is kind of picking up is, again, how deep the population is in how dense the population is, relatively speaking, is inside of the southern part of New Hampshire, and also kind of a bit of the diversity, because oftentimes in the United States, if there's greater concentrations of people, that's also tends to be where diversity is too, of different kinds of diversity. Um, and yet at the same time, let's say Dartmouth College is in Grafton area, Grafton County. It's an N. So but even though it's an N, it's actually, there's quite a bit of concentrations of population in certain places, like Lebanon, where Andrew Yang visited last month, and it was they were going to have a meeting at Salt Hill, this sort of like restaurant bar, but they had too many people, and so they ended up just sort of coming off Salt Hill and going into the Lebanon Green, just to and hear Andrew out in the cold. And so, so in a way, it's like every county is always important. And so what the treasure map is good for, helping you to have some context for the counties that are close to you, that you happen to live in or live nearby, or actually it's a valuable thing in terms of just for those of you who actually know New Hampshire and know these counties, you are going to see a lot of things relative to someone who has less experience with New Hampshire. So so basically what we want to so we have like Highway 89 kind of going through Grafton into Vermont, coming into like towards Concord and Manchester, and then you have like the main highway from Boston kind of working its way up to Concord, and et cetera. I think I want to mention something about racial diversity in New Hampshire. In a way, it's very similar to what I would say about Iowa. Like, I think the biggest misconception is people think Iowa is super white. It is pretty white, but there's actually is some different communities of color in Iowa. Well, in New Hampshire, it's sort of the same thing. I mean, it's very dominantly white. Like, there's a lot of white people, but there are communities of color, and they tend to be in areas of like, mostly in like the concentrations tend to be like in areas of the South, like in Concord, Manchester, sort of like sometimes like actually Nashua in particular. Nashua, New Hampshire has more diversity in terms of a higher rate of African American, Hispanic American, Asian than the state as a whole. I mean, it's really pretty significant. I'm not sure if it still exists, but when I go to Manchester, I mean, there was actually an Asian food market in Manchester. So we should not we should not make assumptions about how get too carried away saying that this place is not diverse, because there are pockets of diversity, like really throughout the states, and it's important for us to discover them and to outreach to them. I'll give you an example of that, just as an example of like, I guess, local color. I was gone to the local Dunkin' Donuts in my town in Lebanon one night, and it was kind of quiet. They were near closing, and there were two white people there. Like, the white woman was the manager and then running the Dunkin' Donuts, and there was a white man there, and they were sitting around. And we're all just talking. Hey, you're just talking about life. And I watched the gentleman mention how his son had nappy hair. And I was like, what? And then the woman who they knew each other, but she started talking about how she had a child, too, about hair. And then it turns out that both of them had black children. So like one through adoption and one biologically. And so I think overall, what I'd say about New Hampshire, and one of the reasons that I like it, it really, at least I found it to be a place where you really were and could be treated as an individual, you know, and so that's kind of refreshing. And so, so it is coming up very soon, New Hampshire, and so I would, those of you who are from New Hampshire, download your treasure map, or you know, so you have your own, and you know, those rest, everyone else, I encourage you to get your own treasure maps, and either through what's listed here, info@abundanceforamerica.com, or you can just email me directly at q@abundanceforamerica.com, or post. Yeah, I welcome your ideas on what are best ways to conduct something like this, like where I would focus on a state, or we can or convene something where those of us and you know, Yang supporters from a particular state, we all be together, perhaps on a Zoom, to discuss the particulars of what we're doing and where we need to be, given the very short time frame and of the way this primaries take place. Because once again, pretty much by mid-March, most of the voting will have happened. Most of the parameters of all this will happen. So, so to everyone, you know, best of luck to everyone in Iowa who are like doing the canvassing, doing the phone, people who are phone banking to Iowa, and just I encourage everyone to remember that at this stage of the campaign, it's not necessarily just the organization that we do. And it's really strange for me, perhaps it might be seem strange for me to hear me say that, because I'm the PhD in organizations who's basically saying it's not just about the organization. But at this stage of the game, especially the way that the caucus is run, I think a lot of what's going on about how well we do is going to be in the atmosphere. It's like how we show up. It's like, it's not just that we make the phone calls, but what's our spirit when we do that? When we meet people, when we canvass, when we meet people and we talk about Andrew Yang, like what kind of spirit and aura do we bring? You know, what kind of spirit do people get from the campaign when they hear about David Chappelle endorsing Yang and Nettie's phone banking for him and doing fundraisings for him talking about why he supports him? At this stage, the spirit of it is everything. So I encourage everyone to be like Andrew Yang. You know, everyone, like all the other candidates, like Andrew Yang, because he's a good, solid dude. He's gracious, and he's etc. So yeah, so this really isn't a time to be slamming other candidates. I don't think it ever really was in this mean, malicious way. Let other candidates sometimes have supporters that do that because they get kind of, concerned and defensive. We don't need to do that because we have a really great candidate and we have a really great platform, and we just need to shine the light. And and it all begins. The primaries have begun. Early states have started voting, like some of the early voting in places like Minnesota. That's already happening. So the primaries have begun. We're in get out the vote time, and so we'll see our first results on Monday night. So the beginning's in the hands of the Iowans. Take care.